Okay, this presentation is about the things that happened in Roswell, New Mexico in the summer of 1947. Now, in fact, this actually occurred on June the 24th. A pilot was flying over Mount Rainier and saw 9 disc-shaped objects. Started a pandemonium across the country where people were seeing these disc-shaped objects. This is the first time they were referred to as discs. It's when they were spotted by this pilot over Mount Rainier. A couple nights later, north of Roswell, New Mexico, on the Mac Braswell was the manager of this farm, and there was a horrible thunderstorm in the middle of the night. And the next day he goes out to go over the ranch, as farmers quite do, to make sure their fences are still intact. And he comes over this rise, and there's a field, about 3 football fields of scattered debris. So he clutches up this debris and carries it down to the courthouse in the city of Roswell, which is 70 miles away. 70 miles is quite a bit back in those days before you had serious roads, so it took him several hours to get there. So he gets down to the courthouse and he talks to the sheriff. In the jailhouse at the same time was the local news reporter, and the news reporter testimony is here.
And it turns out to be W.W. Braswell. He's quite upset, and as the conversation went along, there were some rather sensational subjects came up, and I ultimately recommended that he go to the Roswell Army Air Force Base and give this information to those people, as they were flyers and would know what to do about anything that flies.
This is the airplane that dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, both of them. And this was the home base, was Roswell Air Force Base, was the home base for the Enola Gay. And people say, well, why would they, the aliens be interested in Roswell? Well, this is the place where the atomic bomb had been tested, and the atomic bomb base. So again, it was quite an important base at the time. And so they come to the base and they send out 2 soldiers to go look at the debris. And there was a couple of crash sites, and they got to the debris, and the main fellow was Jesse Marcel Sr. And this is the interview of Jesse Marcel Jr., who was 11 years old at the time that his dad did this, went up and brought this material. And here he brought the material to his house on his way back to Roswell. So this is Jesse Marcel Jr.'s testimony.
My dad came into my room very excited, and he wanted to show us some material that he'd found. I think the inclination or intimation there was this was part of a flying saucer. Out of all the debris that I saw that night, the strangest thing that I recall seeing was the beam, or the I-beam.
Years later, Jesse Marcel Jr. commissioned an artist to recreate the mysterious I-beam.
I recall picking it up like this and looking at the inside surface and seeing the symbols. The color, the purple-violet hue. I have not seen anything that looked like that before nor since.
And after they looked at this material, they decided to release to the public the details of this. He checked with his upper echelons, and they said, go ahead and release the data. So the next day, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Roswell time, they released the newspaper, and it says, it was Army Air Corps at the time, Roswell Army Air Corps captures flying saucer and ranch in Roswell Region, and explained what happened. And after this has been released for about 4 hours, the General Ramey, called up to the local Army base and said, no, you're going to retract everything. We're going to tell everybody this was a weather balloon. So they retracted the testimony, and they retracted it, and to everybody else they made a mistake and it was a weather balloon. And after that point in time, the rancher, Mac Braswell, come back into the radio station and talked to the radio DJ again.
He said, we've discovered that this was a weather balloon. He said, I was told to come and tell you this story, or it would go hard with me, meaning him, and then I advised him that they couldn't tell him what to do, that nobody is going to be able to put pressure on him. And after making my little speech, again in that very quiet voice, Braswell says, I'm not so sure of that.
Joyce also claims that the cowboy found more than space-age debris out in the desert. The retired newsman says that Braswell saw dead alien bodies.
I said this, he didn't. Little green men. And without me saying another word comes the quiet voice from the corner. They weren't green. So that was the first time that he really shook me on, hey, those bodies he's talking about must have been there.
So they took the material up and flew it to Fort Worth, where the Army Command next level up was, General Ramey. And General Ramey looked at the material, and he asked Major Marcel, take me in the next room and show me on the map where this happened. So he had the material spread out on the floor, and he goes in the next room, explaining to him about the map, and he comes back out, and all the material he brought's gone, and there's a beat-up weather balloon. And the general says, hold up the weather balloon and don't say a word. His son told me that's about as pissed as he's ever seen his dad. What the hell am I doing holding this crappy weather balloon? That's not what I brought here. But anyway, so he was holding up the weather balloon. He died in 1981. This is one of the few on-camera interviews he gave of his testimony. So again, this is Jesse Marcel Sr., the intelligence officer who went out and found the material.
One thing I was certain of, being familiar with all air activities, that it was not a weather balloon, nor an aircraft, nor a missile. It was something else of which we didn't know what it was. There were just fragments strewn all over the area, so we proceeded to pick up the parts. A lot of it had a lot of little members with symbols that, to me, I call them hieroglyphics because I could not interpret them, could not be read. They were just like symbols of something that meant something. These little members could not be broken, could not be burned. I even tried to burn that, would not burn. See, that stuff weighs nothing. It's not any thicker than tinfoil in a pack of cigarettes.
Ramey, here's General Ramey and his Colonel DeBose, his assistant, holding up the weather balloon and kind of laughing. And if you notice real closely, good old General has a memo in his hand. And since then, the people have blown up the memo and tried to read the memo. So here's an analysis of what the memo says.
The two words here are weather balloons. These words are very important because it tells us that this is about Roswell, because Ramey's trying to sell a weather balloon story to the press. It's not his lunch order, it's not his laundry list, it's not Mrs. Ramey telling him to bring groceries home. All right.
Rudiak's inquiry began by focusing on the most readable key words and phrases.
Here's the word disc, and it's in quotes because there's a new use of the word, and they typically put the word disc in quotes. Another group of words that everybody sees are right here. It's Fort Worth, Texas.
Another key word was identified, both by Rudiak and other researchers who have analyzed the memo.
Up here is a key word that was picked out by the first group. They read this as victims up here. Here's a graphic of this keyword victims. These letters underneath are actual teletype font. I'm just assuming that we have these 4 letters. The question is how many words in the English language will fit that? And here they are. The only word that seems to fit is victims. So the word victims is critical because it's really the first documentary confirmation that there actually were casualties or bodies involved with Roswell. It's all been based on witness testimony up to this point.
Rudiak believes that by piecing together the most legible words and phrases, even the simplest reading of the Ramey memo is incriminating.
Of course, if you have this phrase up here, which is in the first paragraph, says, and the victims of the wreck. If there were victims, this can't be explained by a balloon crash.
Here's another testimony of a fellow named Mo Cox. And this is the only interview he's ever given. And he died about a year or so after giving this interview. And he'll tell you why he's scared and what he's seen.
We were all top secret, crypto cleared. And the information that we had in our heads would have been extremely valuable to foreign nations. Major took me back, opened the file cabinet. He said, look here. On the front of the drawer, it said Operation Blue Book. He said, this might interest you in big old thick photo. Roswell, 47. One picture showed 3 dead aliens laying side by side, apparently on some kind of a canvas or cloth, and showed 2 others standing side by side. I assumed they were the ones that lived.
According to Cox, the file also contained photos of the crashed spacecraft.
Saucer, as they call it, was not round as it's been depicted in most cases. It was more egg-shaped front to rear, from what little I could see. The whole back right corner was missing, just a big nothing. I was counseled just before I retired that I would keep my mouth shut to what I knew, or forget it, I was Fort Leavenworth bound. I didn't want to go to Fort Leavenworth, so I kept my mouth shut about all this until, I guess about a year, a little better ago. I finally figured it's time somebody knew that it really did happen.
He never made any money out of it, and he gave his testimony. This next one, Stanton Freeman, who is one of the major investigators, and here's where he requested under the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act.
Perfectly normal looking, top secret plus. You never see the plus. That special compartmented information. We expected a little censorship, and, it's not too surprising there's some blacked out stuff. But then it gets so darn heavy. And it's truly laughable. You're telling me there's no cover-up? This isn't the documents, remember? This is the justification for withholding the documents. Somebody actually went through and measured this stuff, and it's 75% blacked out.
I don't know what they're hiding. One of the interesting fellows we met on our first visit out there was Edgar Mitchell, who was the 6th man to walk on the moon. My wife and daughter and him had to sit down and had dinner one night. We had listened to him speak at this presentation here, and he walked in the restaurant by himself, so we invited him over and had dinner with him. Not often you get to meet someone who's walked on the moon. Interesting fellow. He believes that there are UFO crashes with aliens on them, so he's a believer. I went back out there in 2013. We did a dig at the crash site. You can see here where they marked it out in little squares and did metal detector on the squares. We found a couple of anomaly, little pieces of material. Never have heard back as to what the results of it was. But I'm thinking even though the material looked metallic, it may not be metal. In reality, it's some other type of material. And so you may not be able to pick it up with a metal detector. But it's interesting to be out there with 25 members from the MUFON group in Arizona. MUFON's the Mutual UFO Society, who comes out and investigates all the UFO sightings. So it's an interesting group of characters we were with that those 3 days in the desert. Here's the interview my daughter did with one of the people who has first-hand knowledge of it. She was 11 or 12 years old at the time of the event, and she's going to tell you what she saw and what happened to her.
My name is Frankie Rowe. At the time all this happened, it was Dwyer.
Okay. You actually handled the wreckage material. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I handled one small piece that the state policeman brought into the fire station, and he yelled at Daddy, told him I wanted him to get all his guys together. He wanted to show him something that he'd gotten away with, and he was sure that as soon as the government found out he had it, he would lose it. So he pulled his hand out of his pocket and just opened it and dropped it on the table. And when it hit the table, it was just smooth as glass. So all the guys, in turn, went around the table. They picked it up, they played with it, they tried to cut it. They all had big pocket knives. And they had the big Zippo lighters that everybody carried one back then. They all tried to burn it, and it wouldn't burn. And eventually they got tired of playing with it, and it's laying there, and I grabbed it. So I played with it for the next few minutes, and I'd wad it up and drop it, and I'd do that over and over because I couldn't figure out how it worked.
Right.
And you'd try to wad it up in your hand, you couldn't feel it once it's in there.
Right.
So you'd have to look real careful, see if it's there, and then drop it, and it's smooth the time it hits.
Wow.
And it was like holding air in your hand. You couldn't feel it. Absolutely fascinating to play with.
And you said that your dad actually saw the wreckage and saw the
Yes.
bodies and the one survivor who was walking around.
And the one that was alive actually talked to them But he said he didn't say words. They talked to him in their head. And the men standing by the truck asked each other, "Did you understand what he said? What do you think he said?" And they all heard the same thing. But I don't think they even had the terminology mental telepathy back then.
Right.
But they all heard the same thing, they all understood the same thing, and the little person was not afraid of them, and they weren't afraid of the little person.
What was it trying to communicate? Do you tell me?
Daddy was a person that would help everybody with anything. And what can we do to help you? How can we help you? And the little person is saying, you can't. There's nothing you can do to help us. And he was apparently the only one alive. But he said, no, there's nothing you can do to help us.
And you mentioned that, how old were you at the time?
12 years old.
And you mentioned, too, that they came to you and threatened you about...
That was several days later that a military car came driving up. We had a very long driveway because we were out in the country. And one stayed at the car, one guy, kind of like he stood at attention beside the door. One came to the front door, another one went to the backyard where my younger brothers and sisters were playing, and knocked on the door, and of course I ran to the door and Mother was right behind me. He said he wanted to talk to Frankie, and Mother said, well, this is Frankie, and he said, go in, I want to talk to you. And so we went in the dining room. He told Mother he wanted her to sit at the head of the table. I sat at the side, and he stood right in front of me at the other side. And he had a voice I don't know any other time except the one Don mentioned to you, the man on the phone that night.
Right.
That I thought it was him again. And boy, I came unglued. His voice just boomed. He wanted to know why was I there, what was I doing there. And I told him about the doctor's appointment and all of that. And he said, well, I want you to understand one thing, you were never there. And I did not understand that statement at all. And I said, yes, I was. No, you weren't. And he got very angry because I didn't understand what he was saying. And he then finally pulled that nightstick out and started beating his hand with the nightstick. Just every time he'd make a point, hit it. And got to the point where he said, talked about what a big desert this is. They could take us all out and kill us and bury us in the desert. Nobody'd ever find our bodies. And if that wasn't enough, they'd just take us down to the POW camps, because we still had Orchard Park here then. And that was the German POW camp, and the Japanese internment camp was at Artesia. And it was still in existence, but no one was at either place at that point in time. So after he, I guess, duly impressed me, they let me go to the bedroom, and he talked to Mother a couple of minutes, and then he left.
Did your family talk about it at all after he left? Or?
After he left, I never heard a single person in my family say one word about it. Ever. No conversation.
So imagine how scared this little, 12-year-old girl was when the guy's 6'4", has this booming voice, 250 pounds, is banging the nightstick in his hand, and how scared she was. Even today, you can see she's scared even today when she talks about it. They moved the material to Wright-Patterson Field in Ohio. Wright-Patterson Field is the Air Force base where they had reverse engineered all the German aircraft and things that were captured in World War II. Well, they kept it to Wright-Patterson for a few years. Then they traveled and moved it to Area 51, which is 2 hours above Las Vegas. And so that's where they moved it in the early 50s sometime. Here's a picture of Area 51. It's in a valley that they don't allow access to, although every morning you have these airplanes. When you ever go out to Vegas, you'll see these airplanes with the orange stripe around them, and those are the commuter flights from Vegas to Area 51. They'll fly there every day and take them to the hangar they're working in, and they're working that hangar, and then they get back on the planes at night and fly back to Las Vegas and back to their home. So every day that occurring even today. And they do have the signs all the way around it in which they have the restricted areas. If you try to go beyond the restricted area, you'll see these white SUVs up on all the access points outside Area 51, even today, where they're guarding the access to Area 51. People ask me, do you really believe something was there? And it's hard to say there was not. I've been out there 4 times now, and you hear all the eyewitness testimonies. And if you ever want to know more about it, you can go that first week of July, last week of June, when they have the week-long festival out there, and they have all the experts come in. Last time we were out there for the festival, we met a guy named Travis Walton. Travis knew the mate about Travis, and Travis had been abducted by the aliens and kept on an alien craft for 5 days. And hearing his story about what he saw when he was on the craft and what he did. The movie is quite realistic, too, about what it said. And then, of course, there's the movie called Roswell, which is the story pretty well following the events of the crash. People ask what happened to the little alien that survived. And there's several stories about him. One of these stories is that he's alive today, still at Area 51. And people go out there and interact with him today. Another story is, which is quite interesting, that he was at the Air Force Base at Area 51 when they had him in there, and he escaped. And he was out looking in windows to the houses around there, and people started screaming. He tried to get back in, and one of the guards shot and killed him. So there's that one, too. There's several bodies that were shipped around and dissected. And we don't know where they're going to put material they have, but you see when we try to ask the government, we get the video from Stanton Freeman that shows how it's 70% blacked out, what they're going to tell us. So that's about my story. I hope y'all have enjoyed it, and we will see you later.